would like to contribute today about gestures and the idea of transmission through a reading of William Flusser. William Flusser is a Czech-born philosopher and media theorist who left a very important mark on the landscape of contemporary philosophical thought, and especially into the realms of communication, media, and technology. So Flusser's exploration in Les Gestes begins with a fundamental inquiry into the nature of gestures. For him, gestures are not merely bodily movements, but they are already encoded with meaning. So there's a form of communication in gestures that transcends language and serves as a mode of kind of universal expression. So there's basically three major points in his book, which are gesture as communication. So for Flusser, gestures are fundamental aspects of a human existence, and they reveal our intention and our emotions, even if they are used as tools. So by doing something, we also express a sort of immediate and profound level to somebody else that can watch us. There's also the idea that gesture is a media per se. So there's really interesting aspect of Flusser's philosophy is that any body movement is already a form of technology, a form of mediation with the world. And he argues that media such as photography, television, and internet are means through which gestures are captured, transmitted, and transformed. So there is both this idea that gestures are media, but also there is the idea that media are what conventionally makes gestures understandable in a sense, or communicating. And then there's a third aspect, is the ethics of gestures. Gestures are not only communicating, but also they reevaluate the significance of our lives. So my aim here is to understand this idea of gestures through a sort of a comparison between what Flusser calls work and what he calls ritual. And this sort of dualism is actually something that he tries to undo. And by doing so, he also undoes the dualistic difference between nature and culture. Any kind of gesture, like smoking a pipe, can be compared at the same level with another gesture that is technological, like filming or writing. So how can we define rite and ritual? How can we define work? If we look at the terminology, rite for Flusser is already a form of aesthetic, a phenomenon that is already aesthetic. He arrives to this conclusion by celebrating the ceremonial and sacred and symbolic nature of the rituality, which is characterized by regularity. So regularity, organization, obligation, precision are for him this nature, this quality of gesture that can be understood as aesthetics. And what is interesting about the ritual is that, for example, when he describes the gesture of the Japanese tea ceremony, Flusser finds that the gesture is ritualistic because it doesn't really have another finality than the gesture itself. So there is no fixation, no stereotype. The ritual is autonomous. A ritualistic gesture is a gesture that cannot be rationalized. And that's why it is aesthetic. It has in itself its proper meaning, is regulated, is autonomous, and the conception of the gesture make it as a sort of intellectual sophistication that is precisely aesthetic. And then there is the other notion, that is the notion of work. Flusser defines the gestures of work as gestures that both destroy and both make. So what's important, I think, for Flusser to find here is something bigger than materiality, but it has to do with the ethical aspect. If the ritual gesture, as I said, he explains to be an aesthetic dimension, gestures of work are actually related to educational, cultural, and subjective aspect, and so they are related to freedom. And for Flusser, freedom is a synonymous with life, and that cannot have a sort of a meaning that is already there, or a finality that is already there. If we consider the object, as he does, as being not a product, but a problem, then everything changes, in the sense that we have a relationship that is more like a problem-solving relationship than production relationship. But of course, and I think that is also interesting because it empowers the person, the craft person, as you say before, in the sense that the craft person is not the instrument in order to produce the object, because the object is not a product, or only a product, but the object is the problem with which the subject is related to. The object that we are producing is not the result, but it is something that we are also taking into consideration as an input to our own gestures and to our own way of dealing with the gestures that we're doing, and how we transmit them to other people, and how also the technique can be understood from the outside.